and I want to welcome two colleagues to the stage. One, a former colleague, Burnis Morris, who is the author of the biography of Carter Woodson. Burnis is a graduate of Ole Miss and for several years was a member of the journalism faculty here at Ole Miss. And he is, that was back when we were much smaller and were a department in the College of Liberal Arts. Now we're a full-blown school, but Burnis has gone off and has been at Marshall for what, about 13, 14 years?
15, 16 years.
Time flies, okay. But anyway, he is now holds a position at the journalism school there at Marshall University in West Virginia in the name of Carter Woodson. So we're delighted to have Burnis back at Ole Miss, and talking with her, kind of leading the discussion, will be my current colleague, Al Steele. Al, thank you for doing this. She is an assistant professor of journalism here at Ole Miss, and she was last on an Overby program when we featured her book, which was a lovely book called Delta Jewels, subtitled In Search of My Grandmother's Wisdom. So Al and Burnis, it's all yours.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to talking to you about your work. So for the students and for people who are in the audience who may not know who Carter G. Woodson is, could you please just give us a little bit of background information in his tie to West Virginia?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming out. You sort of remind me of the large journalism history classes I used to teach. You know, usually about 100, 120 people. I bet there are 200 people in class now because the enrollment is so high. Carter G. Woodson was the second African American to receive a doctorate at Harvard University, the first being W.B. Du Bois. And Woodson is the son of former slaves, and it's believed that he's the only offspring of former slaves to earn a doctorate in history from any institution. In 1915, Woodson began what we now recognize as the Black History movement. I sliced off the term that people like Dr. Ross would use, the modern Black History movement, because 100 years later, it can't still be modern. But there was very little respect for African American history in 1915 when Woodson began. And if there were occasions for Blacks to be included in history books, often the stories about them were distorted. But usually the case is they were omitted. And Woodson believed that African Americans would gain more respect and that racism would decline if they themselves realized that they had a glorious past, and if other races realized that African Americans had a great past. Just like all races, there are good and bad among them. He didn't want to clean up their image. He simply wanted to tell the real story about African American history. And he believed that one day the races could be equal if each respected the other and learned about other races.
So I read that you were visiting the Underground Railroad Center in Cincinnati, and that might have sparked your interest in writing this book. Is that correct?
Yes, and it certainly was. I had often thought I needed to know a lot more about Woodson, and I had read Miseducation of a Negro, which to this day is the book most people associate with Woodson. It's not his best book, but it was one that was appreciated more by the masses. And when I was leaving the Underground Railroad Museum, I noticed a copy of Miseducation of the Negro, and I had not read the book for several years. And so I purchased a copy and began reading, and I decided I was going to do something about Woodson. Initially, take another look at Miseducation of a Negro. But as I got into it, I realized that everybody wants to reinterpret Miseducation of a Negro. And I discovered an angle that had not been touched before, and that was how Woodson used the black press to popularize history. And I had 2 weeks before the deadline for the West Virginia Humanities Council's grants. And so I I put together a proposal, and fortunately I got funding for that project initially. And the project became what you see today as the book on Carter G. Woodson, History, the Black Press, and his use of public relations.
So he's known as the father of Black History Month. Why did he pick February, and why not June when there's Juneteenth?
Well, often I get irritated when I hear people, many of them well-educated people, say that, why do African Americans always get shortchanged? The shortest month, one of the coldest months for the celebration of Black history. And I get upset because there is no they involved. It was Woodson. He chose the dates of Abraham Lincoln's birthday and Booker T, and not Booker T, but Frederick Douglass's birthday, and for Negro History Week. And Douglass did not know when he was born, but he believed he was born around the February 14th because he was his mother's Valentine. So he told everyone his birthday was February 14th. And so Woodson chose that and Lincoln's birthday to celebrate Negro History Week, which in 1926, and 50 years later, followers of Woodson and other supporters began celebrating Black History Month in February.
So can you explain what Juneteenth is for those who may not know, and why not? I mean, how do you think he would have? What for Juneteenth? Well, first, can you explain Juneteenth for those who?
Well, Juneteenth is not popular across the country. Some regions of the country don't celebrate it. I grew up in Mississippi not hearing the name Juneteenth. But when I worked in Texas, they had Juneteenth parades. Basically, it's when slaves learned of their freedom after the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War for others. But there is no common date, so they call it Juneteenth. It might have been June something. It might have been another month. But it is not celebrated around the country. I don't know what Woodson would have thought of it. I have not seen anything written with him discussing Juneteenth. It's entirely a regional celebration, and he would have supported that if he were aware of it. I don't know. He might have been, because if you take any opportunity to celebrate Black history at a time when no one had any respect for it, I think Woodson would have appreciated it.
Okay. You talked about his work being in newspapers and how he started basically a PR campaign. Can you talk about some of the things that he wrote about, or how he would have used the press to help get his message across? Well,
he made enemies with the church. There are many churches have publications, so he couldn't use the church publications to promote Black history without some form of censorship. He thought there were too many Black churches, too many pastors who were not educated in religion, And he thought that they should get better educated and that there should be fewer of them. He was not alone in that thinking. Booker T. Washington had the same thoughts. But it seemed that Woodson went after them. He went out of his way to attack black pastors, and many church members were offended by that. And so Woodson had to resort to seeking support from another strong black institution. If the church is the strongest, then the black press would be the second strongest. And the members of the black press supported Woodson's objectives in educating the public about black achievements. And Woodson began celebrating the 100th anniversary of the first black newspaper in America. And about the same time as he founded Negro History Week. And he combined the two histories into one. And so you could not discuss black history without discussing black press history. And the members of the press endorsed Woodson. Rarely did they criticize him and his history movement. Sometimes they were critical of him when he picked fights with other members of the black establishment. I think often he did so to gain publicity, but his fights with the church and with some members of black society who seemed to support segregation, Woodson found to be offensive, and he often said so in the newspaper columns he wrote. And but the press enjoyed it. It led to increased readership. He began his movement at a time when literacy was rising among African Americans, and the newspapers were benefiting from that. Woodson was selling books about history. He created a scholarly journal, and he benefited, and so did the newspapers. In PR talk, and there may be one or two PR people here, he believed in balanced communication, that both sides were getting something from it. It wasn't like he was using the black press. They believed in his cause and gave him space in their newspapers to pursue them.
Can you talk about one of the disagreements he would have had with another author or prominent figure? Is there one that stands out?
One that stands out with W.B. Du Bois. Some people Woodson didn't like, wanted to create an African American encyclopedia. And Woodson claimed that he was already doing one and he didn't want these people involved. They didn't invite Woodson to be involved. They invited Du Bois and made him a figurehead. And Woodson was offended. He wrote columns. I can't believe Du Bois would allow this to happen. Remember, Du Bois would have been a bit older than Woodson. I think Du Bois was about 9 years older. And so he got his doctorate from Harvard first. Du Bois's ancestors were not former slaves, unlike Woodson's ancestors. And so there was some clash in both chemistry and in the cultures they produce for their organizations. And they often got along well, but then there were moments when they didn't get along very well. Sometimes Woodson invited Du Bois to give Black history speeches because his lecture circuit required him to be too many places at once. And Du Bois accepted, and Woodson was very proud of his support. But they had different cultures. Du Bois was one of the founders of the NAACP. Woodson supported the NAACP, was very active in Washington, but he wanted to distinguish his work as a scholar, as a historian, from activism. He did not want any of his research assistants to engage in politics or activism. And for that reason, he created many enemies who were just looking for reasons to attack him.
Wow. So what did he think about Booker T. Washington's work?
He was very respectful of Booker T. Washington. I know some of you students have read about the disagreement between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Woodson seemed to be in the middle between Booker T. Washington. His critics claim that he wanted to train blacks for menial jobs, for obsolete jobs, whereas Du Bois is better known for a talented 10th, for the intellectual side of the black mind. Woodson seemed to be somewhat in the middle, but I have friends who disagree with me about that. They claim Woodson was more like Booker T. Washington than Du Bois. And I found a letter at Howard University a couple of years ago that probably is closer to my friend's views than the position I took, but I haven't told him about this letter. This is one he wrote to his sister, and she had lost her job, and he advised her to get some training. He told her to learn how to type and to learn how to spell. And to my friends, they would interpret that as a menial job. Whereas my interpretation typically would be, it's not. Not many black women were hired to be secretaries. You know, it was a very honorable profession. But if you look on a more intellectual side, you would say, you would take Du Bois's position about that. But I sincerely believe that Woodson is in the middle between them. That's why Woodson wanted people to get a better education. The reason he wrote Miseducation of the Negro, he wanted African Americans to learn to think for themselves and solve their own problems. Problem solvers you don't tend to associate with manual labor. Although Woodson would come back and argue that if you start out in a bad position in life, you don't have to stay there. You can get better training and perhaps own the company. You don't have to remain a washerwoman. You can own a dry cleaners, a laundry, a chain of them if you wanted to. So that's why I think Woodson would be in the middle between those two giants in African American history.
I think it's interesting you're talking about, he said you didn't have to stay in the position in which you had. Mm-hmm. Black newspapers, I think some of the pioneers who started Black press, weren't they working for organizations and they saved their money and started the press? I think there was someone that worked for Heinz.
There are all kinds of situations. Some did, some didn't. The first black newspaper was started by the first black college graduate. The greatest black journalist of the 19th century was Frederick Douglass, who's known for his work as an abolitionist, but he was also a journalist. And if you look at many of the civil rights leaders of the 20th century, many of them also had jobs in journalism. I recently saw a documentary on Roy Wilkins, the former head of the NAACP. And when I wrote my book, I was unaware of this fact, but Roy Wilkins was owner of a newspaper, an editor of a newspaper after he left college. That would have helped the book too, but I think I have a lot of information about journalists being helpful to Woodson, but that would have been one more fact that I would have used had I known. Black journalists were like white journalists. They came from all sectors, and white journalists were also part of politics. You know, when I taught journalism history at LSU and here at Ole Miss, I used to tell my students stories about Abe Lincoln's campaign manager was the editor of the New York Times, who was also chair of the Republican Party and lieutenant governor of New York. And he was also a great journalist. So it's very difficult to remove journalists from important issues and leadership roles in society.
So, given how smart Woodson was with using the press and getting his messages across, what do you think he would say about social media using Black History Month with the posts now? How do you think he would feel about that?
I'm sort of torn on this one. On the one hand, it would be difficult for him to use the Black press today the way he used it a century ago, because as you know, readership is less in Black newspapers and in all mainstream newspapers. But again, on the other hand, Woodson was so smart, he would have adapted and he would have learned to use social media to educate people about Black history. He would probably use, if you could only speak in less than 300 characters, you're not going to inform people very much. But if you can drive them to the scholarly journals he published and the books he wrote himself and published by his publishing company, you could see him doing what many book publishers do today. So I think he probably would do well if you're around today.
Okay. Can you expand a little bit more? You talked about Black History Month being commercialized. Can you expand a little bit more about your thoughts?
Well, it's been going on since there was Negro History Week, and Woodson would rail about it every year. Many people find a profit motive in presenting Negro History Week or Black History Month. It's when many publishers release their books. I'm so happy my book came out in October. John Hope Franklin, who is probably better known than Woodson today, John Hope Franklin was mentored by Woodson, and he's even today they call him one of Woodson's boys. Franklin refused to give speeches in the month of February because he thought it had been so commercialized. Every network has something to say about Black History Month because they think it will drive ratings. Publishers will issue their books because they know Blacks are looking to buy books in February. They've been trained to look for them then. But I do think that if we spread it out, not just in 1 month, we will have a better educated population, because Woodson wanted not Black history, not white history, not Asian history. He wanted them all in the same book. And he settled for a week and now a month because that's all he could get. But he looked for the day when Black history would be celebrated year-round and included in all history books, just like the histories of other races are.
So you talked about a letter that you read that he wrote to his sister. Can you talk about some of the other sources that you had in your book?
Well, the book, the basis of it is the several Black newspapers that are now digitized. I probably couldn't have done this book 20 years ago because there were not many Black newspapers that were digitized. And I was able to go through those papers from the Woodson era as well as the Woodson papers. The Library of Congress received the first batch of Woodson's papers in the 1920s. He probably favored the Library of Congress because they were welcoming to all researchers when he was working on his dissertation. The papers were begun in the 20s, and he added to them over several years. If any of you are interested in the Woodson era or Black history generally, you can ask the Ole Miss Library to obtain the Woodson papers on disc. Actually, they're on reels, but you're able to download them to disc, and without charge. I also spent time at Virginia State University. One of Woodson's researchers and major fundraisers was on the history faculty there, Luther P. Jackson. And I found correspondence between him and Woodson over a 20-year period that I found valuable. And one of the chapters is based on that correspondence. I also spent much time at the Chicago Regional Library, which is called the Carter G. Woodson Regional Library. And Emory University, about 10 years ago, purchased Woodson's papers that he had not given to the Library of Congress. And I spent quite a bit of time at those different locations.
How long did it take you to write the book?
Well, I received the grant from the Humanities Council in 2011, and about the same time, I was chosen as a Drinko Fellow. That is an academy created by a Marshall University alumnus to honor faculty. And so each year they would select someone based on the research he or she was doing and give them all kinds of resources to spend full time doing it. And it's sort of like a MacArthur program. You can't apply for it. They hear about your work and they choose you. I think they want that mystery there to make it even more important. And I have no idea how I was chosen. All I know is a couple of months before, my dean asked for my vita, and he told me he couldn't tell me what it was about. And 2 months later, I received a call. And so I received tremendous support from the Drinko Academy. And Drinko requires a lecture on your year of research. And I presented my research in 2012, and I decided at that point I had too much material to just end it with a lecture, and so I expanded it to the book. And the hardback came out in fall of 2017, and the paperback just a few months ago in October.
So based off all your research and all of your writing, is there anything that you learned about Woodson that surprised you?
Well, one major thing is he practiced what he preached. Remember I told you he picked fights with pastors and churches. And he was very critical of pastors who obtained great wealth from their congregations. And when they died, instead of leaving it to their church members, they would leave their wealth to their family members. And Woodson thought that was outrageous. And the Baltimore Afro-American, a very good newspaper, which is still in existence, decided to determine whether Woodson was telling the truth about this. So they did their own investigation, and published an article saying Woodson was right. But little did we know when Woodson was complaining in the 1930s about these pastors, that Woodson would not make the same mistakes. He left everything he owns, including one of the largest black publishing companies in the world, a scholarly journal, and another magazine for children, and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which launched the Black History movement. He left all of that except $500 each to a sister and two brothers. He had received lots of publicity for not marrying and saying he couldn't afford a wife because he lived frugally. He only spent about $12 a week, and he sent a lot of money to his widowed sister in Huntington, West Virginia. Well, it turns out the home that his sister was living in was a home that Woodson owned, but he didn't leave her the home. He left it to the association. His sister had to purchase the home from the association. I call that practicing what you preach.
Is this journal still in publication now?
I'm sorry?
Is this journal still in publication?
Oh, yes. It's now called the Journal of African American History.
Okay. And so you mentioned that he grew up in West Virginia. What was his childhood like? Do you know a little bit about that?
Well, he was born in Virginia, and his family moved to Huntington, West Virginia. There were very few high schools for African Americans in Woodson's day, but they were building one in Huntington named the Frederick Douglass High School. And Woodson attended that school. He didn't enroll until he was almost 20, and he graduated about a year later. He was working in the coal mines, and he often would just show up to take the tests, and he did very well.
So I have one more question before we'll have you do your slideshow, and then we'll open it up for questions. How do you think we're doing with educating people about Black history and Mississippi in particular?
Well, I've been away from Mississippi for a long time, so I can't speak specifically about Mississippi. But there are several school systems doing very well. Many are not. Many colleges are not incorporating Black history into their regular curriculum. When I taught journalism history, in the back of the book, there would be a chapter on ethnic media, but the first 500 pages would be about all the European-influenced media. And nowadays, I'm certain that in graduate classes, professors will assign other books, but undergraduates probably don't get very much. But in elementary, middle schools, and high schools, that's where the Woodson's name is known. They're taught who Woodson is and how he began his work.
Well, I have one more question. What's next for you?
It's hard to get rid of a project you've worked on for years. So my next one is the Woodson Century. All the things he influenced over a century. He lived from his work in Black history would have been 1915 to 1950 when he died. But in the some 50 years after his death, you can still see the impact he had from the first half of the century. And I think that needs to be explored.
I imagine he was very helpful with the Great Migration as
well. He anticipated the Great Migration. One of his great books was the migration of African Americans in the 19th century. And he saw this second wave coming. Well, you've had Black newspapers since 1826. Woodson's era would have been 1915 to 1950. You have the Chicago Defender, which had a circulation of more than 200,000, as well as the the Afro in Baltimore during that period. The major black newspapers would have been the Defender, the Afro, and the Norfolk Journal and Guide. There are about 8 of them on a data file that the Library of Congress has of African American newspapers that have been digitized.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Who's talking? Okay.
There's been some work done recently on the way in which Liberty Washington controlled the press, so like how does hostility function to suppress any messages that were kind of contra that from the uplift. And I wonder if you found anything that Woodson was commenting toward that, or how he felt about press suppression.
I never saw anything of Woodson criticizing Booker T. Washington. He always referred to him as the great educator. But clearly in my mind, there were distinctions between their advocacy of education. Woodson wanted people who could think and solve their problems, whereas we tagged Booker T. Washington as a figure who wanted to train blacks for menial jobs or jobs that would soon disappear. But I think because he was from an earlier era, he was concerned about extermination, and Woodson was concerned about extermination as well. They were concerned that blacks might be returned to slavery. And so Booker T. Washington wanted to reassure blacks to reassure whites that blacks were no threat to them. There are people who are critical of that kind of thinking today, but if you're concerned that a population could be wiped out, it might be time for a leader who would address that issue. Later generations, like W.B. Du Bois, had the luxury of advocating better education for blacks and challenge white races. Booker T. Washington couldn't do that.
Yes, Tim.
Can you speak about the relationship between Woodson and Ida Willow?
That's a funny one.
That's a good one.
She was a big supporter of Woodson, but she was disappointed that he didn't give her credit for her anti-lynching campaign. There was, in the Miseducation of the Negro, Woodson talks about the anti-lynching, but he doesn't mention her name. But he argues that his campaign to educate black minds was more important than the anti-lynching campaign. And when you understand Woodson's thinking, education was the most important thing. If he was arguing that if people were properly educated, there would be no lynching. Mm-hmm.
Joe?
You mentioned Woodson's battles with churches. Was he particularly religious himself?
He went to church. He went to several different churches. He was probably your typical person who would go to church, but he wasn't holier than thou. He would quote from the Bible, but not like an over-religious person. But they thought he was their enemy because he probably understood the Bible better than many people who were criticizing him. And they took offense when he said that they were not educated on the Bible. But he certainly went to church. The First Baptist Church in Huntington was built by Woodson's uncle, who was among the first black residents of Huntington. So there's a lot of religion in his background. He just thought it should be better organized.
Any other questions? I have one more. he seemed very forward thinking. How do you think he felt about women writers when we talked about Ida B. Wells?
He was very supportive of women writers, of women rights. There have been a number of articles written about that. Now some are critical that he didn't support women strong enough. But I think that by any honest measurement, he was a supporter of women's rights and of women authors. Now, some people point out he didn't publish women writers in his journal, which would be a true test. But I'm sorry, black women writers. But his journal was known to print more articles by women than other historical journals. But people criticize him for not doing enough.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Professor Morris.